There we go. Okay. So welcome again to our retreat on contemplative ecology. We're going to start with a little meditation as we did yesterday, a little time of centering. So I would invite you to find a comfortable seat, someplace, a posture that will allow you to really ground yourself and become present to this moment. Begin by turning your attention to your breathing. You can notice the rise and fall of your chest and belly and back. You don't have to control your breath or judge your breath or anything like that. You can simply notice it. Noticing is enough. And notice what the feel of your breath is like entering and exiting your body, rising and falling in your chest, your back, your belly. Notice if turning your attention to your breath changes your breath. And it doesn't have to, there's no reason it has to, but notice if it does on its own. Breathing in and breathing out. Giving thanks for this nourishing function that our body does pretty much on autopilot for most of us. And I would invite you to turn your attention now to your body, to notice the feel of your body in this moment, in this place, at your desk or your sofa, or taking a walk outside, or wherever you find yourself in this moment. Notice how it feels to be in your body right now. And notice if you have any sensation in your body, any tension or emotion or whatever it might be, fatigue, happiness, could be anything at all. Simply notice without judging, neither good nor bad, only sensation. And if there is something in your body that catches your awareness and holds on to it, notice if you can gently release whatever in your body is grabbing your attention. And if you can't, that's all right too. It's enough simply to notice it. Now, I would invite you to expand your awareness beyond your body into your spiritual body. To notice if there's anything at all that is, again, causing sensation in your spiritual body. An insight or a grief or a longing, anything at all, an excitement. And if there is something in your spiritual body that's causing sensation, you might find that it's also tied into your physical body because the two are not really separable in the end. But notice if you can release whatever you're holding on to. And again, if you can't, that's okay too. Simply noticing is enough. for a poem to start us off and get us moving into our talk this afternoon. I have a poem called Union Creek in Winter by Edward Harkness. And before I read it, I would encourage you again to, as much as possible, stay centered in your body and your spirit, to notice how this poem, how the words of this poem land in your body, in your spirit. There's no word for it so far, the word for what it means to be in love with you in our sinking world, what it means to hike through new snow, to hear beneath the glass of creek ice the flow of winter percolating its way through the ravine, not quite soundlessly toward lower ground, to join the wild roar of the American river. The word that means we've loved through the avalanches of our time, loved while the wars raged, paid for with our taxes, loved while our loved ones voted for hatred, for I want the false past, I want what's coming to me, protected as they've been by their skin, white as this very snow, draped on hemlocks in the ravine's wavering light. The word that means we're not alone. We share that same nature wonder, for the flicker tapping on a far-off tree, the delicate calligraphy of a mouse's prints along our path, as if Tu Fu has been here too, who knew even then, even in the Tang dynasty, beauty leaves behind its faint notations. The word that means we will go on. We will follow an earlier trekker's snowshoe trail, slog on bundled to keep the chill from overtaking us, descend again steeply, then climb again switchbacks above the creek, away from its cold murmurings, to our car and the long drive back to the war zone of now. Armed with our little courage, we must drive straight to the front, strap on flak jackets, and begin the slow search for survivors. Slow search for the words that might revive them. Even now, we're feverish to make contact, to know what to listen for, to learn to hear those muffled cries from deep in the rubble. If we knew the words, we might save those most weakened, most in danger of giving up. If we knew the words, we might keep the world, its rivers, its ice, its bitter root, its winter wrens, its hemlocks, its moonlight, its children, its Shakespeare, its Zimborska, its rose hips, its green and orange lichens, its Dylan, its kora players, its hummingbirds, you, me, and our Muslim neighbor Maya alive. Our talk this afternoon I've called From Betrayal to Hope. And I think this poem sets the stage perfectly for the context in which we find ourselves in the world today, and certainly for the reflections that I find myself compelled to make in the midst of a pandemic and the environmental degradation that certainly predates this pandemic, but also contributes to it and sets the context for it. A friend of mine sent me this poem 2 years ago, I think it was, right before actually I gave the first version of this contemplative ecology retreat. And it was the fall, it was October, and I remember that year that the maple trees were very late in turning orange, as late as I could remember. And that observation joined in my mind with what I had been reading. I think the UN at that point had just put out a new report on climate change that we had to act right now, or by 2040 we would face climactic disaster. And that's only 20 years from now, today, and I think the time frame has gotten shorter in the 2 years since then. I see some of you nodding. And so I really found myself in that moment a couple of years ago in this place very close to despair, very close to wondering how could we find hope in the midst of this world that we live in that seems to actually get darker. I mean, the darkness, I think, threatens to overwhelm us more with every passing day. And I still find myself asking, what does hope look like in the midst of this context today? But the maples really made it real for me, because the maples are not even 100 feet from our front door here. They surround us and they're dying. I mean, we can see a time in my lifetime, most likely, if I live, a normal lifespan, when there will not be a New England fall anymore, because the maples need a certain amount of cold to have their seeds germinate in the winter. And I think of these maples as so much a part of my my experience of the place that I live in, and so deeply tied to my experience of beauty and my sense of well-being and spiritual nourishment. What does it mean that they may not be here by the end of my life? This poem really gets at that struggle to find meaning and hope in the midst of the darkness. And this call in the poem from the very beginning, there's no word for it so far. The word for what it means to be in love with you in our sinking world. What does it mean to be in love in our sinking world? To be in love with the maples, with our spouse or our children or our God, with our community. What does that mean in this context that we're in? What is the word for that? And although when I offered this poem a couple of years ago to the retreat group I was leading, there were people who felt that the language, particularly at the end about going into a war zone, there were people who felt that that was overblown. I wonder how many of us would feel that way today in the context that we're in. I mean, I didn't feel 2 years ago that it was overblown, but we are now spending, in terms of stimulus relief, as much as we do in times of war. We are seeing people die all around us as we do in times of war. And I don't think we can take coronavirus outside of the context of environmental disaster. It's very much tied into to the environment and to really the way that we have been living on this planet for the last 100 years. And the way that we may very well continue to live on this planet after we're all out of our self-quarantine. So when I ask the question, are we living in a time of war right now? I don't find it far-fetched to say, yes, we are. Now, we may have to stretch our sense of what war means beyond infighting between nations. But we're certainly living in a time of disaster and catastrophe and plague and pandemic that has many of the same characteristics that war has. Yesterday, one of you, maybe it was Nicole, I'm trying to remember your name exactly, asked me about evil and where does evil come in creation. And it's really a very interesting and important question to be asking. Yes, it was Nicole. I see the chat. And actually, before you even asked the question, Nicole, I have this in my outline for today. Is this virus evil? This virus that we are faced with, is it evil? One of the definitions that I work with around evil is that God unites and evil divides. God unites and evil divides. So where there is unity, connection, healing, reconciliation, that is of God. And where there is division, fear, hatred, denial, all of that is of evil. Now, of course, that's a simplistic definition because the word of truth divides, sharper than any two-edged sword, as the saying goes. So it's not that what is of God can't cut through, isn't sharp. The truth is sharp and will divide truth from falsehood, But at the end of the day, whatever action of God, such as the refiner's fire, for instance, that may have a violent or a dividing characteristic to it, ultimately does that with the aim of healing. So the ultimate end of God is to unite and to heal, whereas the ultimate end of evil is to keep either an individual or a society or what have you divided. So I think we can't really say one way or the other about a virus, where I take that back. I don't think you could say that a virus is evil. A virus is simply neutral. The way that human beings respond in this particular moment can either be evil or can be of God. And I think we've yet to see how we as a planetary community will respond to this particular moment of crisis. But I have to say, I'm not optimistic. I really am not. And I'm not trying to be a downer here. We're going to get into some of this. I know this talk is starting off on may seem like a downer kind of note, but I think if we look at contemplation as we did yesterday as a long, loving look at the real, it's important to look at the truth. And the truth is, we have known that a pandemic was coming for years and years and years, and we could have prepared for it, and we didn't prepare for it. We have known that environmental degradation is not only a future reality, but is a present reality. And we have known that we needed to act decisively and act immediately in order to prevent the worst kind of disaster, and we haven't done it. Not on the scale that we need to do it. And I don't have a lot of optimism that we as a human people will learn what we could learn from this moment of pandemic and change the way that we live. I think there will be people, individual peoples and some communities that will learn. And I think there will be more people who have learned at the end of the pandemic than there were at the beginning. But I'm not sure that we are not going to learn on the scale that we need to learn. And so I find that for me, it's really important to start there with the truth of where I am in the midst of all of this. And you may be there, and you may be in a more optimistic place, or you may be in a more despairing place than that. But I think that we need to start with where we are in order to find hope, which after all is the topic that I'm here to talk to you about today. But we have to start where we are. So the topic today that is called, or the talk I've called From Betrayal to Hope, I want to start with the betrayal piece. I think betrayal is a very good word for what we are experiencing right now. Our comfortable sense of the world as a place that will continue the way it has continued, without discomfort, without economic collapse, without environmental collapse, without death and dying. Our sense that the world will pretty much continue as it has for the last many years has been totally done away with. We can't pretend that that's the case anymore. And one way we can describe that sort of experience is betrayal, that our sense of what the world was has been betrayed. Our sense of security has been betrayed. Our sense that we will be economically, materially better off than our parents' generation was. I am of the first generation, really, that can say that that's not true. My generation will be worse off than my parents' generation. And now I won't have children because I'm a monk, but those who come after me will be worse off than my generation is. That's almost certain. So the American dream is turning out to be a kind of betrayal in this moment as well. That we're on this long march toward economic and material progress. It turns out, though, that betrayal may be a very, very good thing for our spiritual health. So while we're not on the long march of material and economic progress, we may be on the long march of spiritual, moral, ethical progress here. The word betrayal literally means handing over. The word that's used in the gospel accounts of Judas, the betrayer, is paradidomi, which means to hand over. And many of the older translations of the New Testament will actually talk about Judas handing over Jesus rather than betraying him. And betrayal can be a kind of handing over if we let it be. This is really the dark, mysterious center of our faith. That you don't get Easter Sunday without Good Friday. You don't get the resurrection without the crucifixion. And actually, Judas, the betrayer, doesn't only hand over Jesus to death, but hands over Jesus to fuller, deeper life in God. He performs the essential action that has to happen for God's work in Jesus to be made complete, for God's glory to be fully manifest in Jesus. I long to hear a sermon, and maybe I will get to preach on Maundy Thursday some year, but I long to hear a Maundy Thursday sermon that talks about Judas as having carried out this essential piece of God's work. And I wonder, actually, and there's no scriptural evidence for this, but it's my own kind of mind takes me there. I wonder if perhaps Judas was the closest possible companion to Jesus, the one that Jesus could trust, the only one he could trust to carry out this essential piece that anyone else would have said, oh, no, 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 I'm not going to betray you to death. How could I possibly do that? Just as Peter says when Jesus says, yes, you're right, I'm the Messiah, and I will have to, go to Jerusalem and be crucified. And Peter says, oh, no, God forbid. Perhaps Judas was the one who said, I will do even this for you. And whether that's true or not in historical fact and in the scriptural account, I think that kind of imagining takes us deeper into the movement of betrayal. Because whether Judas was consciously aware of what he was doing or not in betraying Jesus, his action did hand Jesus over for crucifixion so that he could be resurrected. Now, don't ask me why the cross was essential. I can't tell you that. That is, again, when I talk about betrayal as the dark, mysterious center of our faith, I can't tell you why that is. But I have observed that movement in my own inner life and in the inner lives of many people that I have worked with and talked with, that the point of our woundedness, our hurt, and our struggle, that those places within us individually and collectively can be gateways to new and deeper life in God. You look at the alcoholic who hits rock bottom and goes into recovery, and then one of the promises in Alcoholics Anonymous is that I will no longer regret the past, but I will see how what has happened in my life can actually help other people. That is the promise that God makes to all of us. And it may not be alcoholism, it may be many other things. But there are often those places within our own lives that are the most hurt, or where we have the most struggle, where life has betrayed us in the most direct and powerful ways. Those places can be the doorway into new life, to new and deeper life in God. I often think in this sense about St. Augustine, who is the patron saint of love. He has this radical, beautiful descriptions of the love relationship with God. And if you know anything about his biography, you know that he struggled his entire life with intimacy. He found friendship to be almost unbearable because of his fear that he would lose the people that he most loved. And he had a series of promiscuous relationships before he became a celibate. And there's this sense that the very thing he most struggled with became what flowered up in him. We often think that it's our gifts and our talents that are the core of God's wonderful work within us, but it may actually be the pieces that we struggle with that are the sort of root that flowers then. This is Paul talking about the thorn in his flesh and saying, I prayed for this to be removed from me, and God's answer was, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. So this is the kind of place where only metaphor can really describe the power that betrayal has to hand us over to new life. And one of the stories that I think best describes this, and the Orthodox are really big on this, is Christ's descent into hell. And we don't make a whole lot of this in the Western tradition in Christianity, but it is a part of our tradition that on Holy Saturday, Jesus descended to the dead and brought the righteous souls out of the land of the dead, out of hell. And there's this sense that, and we talk about Christ breaking open the gates of hell, so that the gates are wide open at that point. But a lot of Orthodox theologians will say that hell at that point becomes a sacred place because Christ has walked there. Christ has consecrated hell by being present there. And I really think that Christ does the same thing with our own inner hells, those places within us that are most tormented and tortured, that actually God has been there long before we ever became aware of those places. And most of us, and I'm in this category, are terrified to go there, don't want anything to do with those places within us. But I have had really incredible moments of prayer when I asked God to guide me into those places. And I would encourage you, as in your own prayer life, to try that at some point when you have a lot of Kleenex next to you, because, you know, the waterworks will turn on, you know, but there may be a moment in your life when you feel called to do that, and to realize that actually, if God has already been there, then God can show you the way there. So it's not you taking God to this place, it's you asking God to take you to that place and to show you around. And it just may be that Christ is already waiting within our own personal and collective hells to break us out of the prison and set us free. Having had that experience individually, and to the extent that we may have had it collectively, though I would say we really still need to have it collectively, we then have a foundation to hope. I think that hope without that particular foundation of having experienced in even a small way betrayal as a handing over from death to life, hope is synonymous with optimism. And hope that is synonymous with optimism will be crushed the moment that we're contradicted, as we will certainly be. Václav Havel has something to say about the difference between hope and optimism. And on the eve of the Velvet Revolution in what was then Czechoslovakia, this is what he said about hope. He says, "The kind of hope I often think about, especially in situations that are particularly hopeless, such as prison, I understand above all as a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul. It is not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as optimism that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as optimism that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Hope is not optimism. It is not the same as optimism. In the Christian tradition, we talk about hope as one of the three theological virtues, where Paul says, faith, hope, and love remain. And the greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love, traditionally, we talk about as the theological virtues in Christianity. And we have this sense running throughout the whole Christian tradition that our hope is not the hope that of the world around us for Christians. That hope is founded on God's loving, radical, freeing action in Jesus Christ. And that's why I say that if we're really to have hope, particularly in, as Václav Havel says, in situations that are particularly hopeless, such as prison, and I would add pandemics and global economic and environmental collapse. If we're to have hope in these times, it cannot be based on what we see in the world around us. It cannot be based on optimism that everything is going to work out, whatever that means. Hope has to be based in our understanding and our really lived experience of Christ's resurrection, of Christ's resurrected life within us, individually and communally. And I think that to the extent that we have had that experience, we do have hope. We have hope that, well, ultimately that death is not the last word. We have hope that life continues beyond what we understand. And I'm not, and I hope you don't hear me saying this, that I'm not saying, oh, just have faith in God and everything will be fine. That's not what I'm saying. Or that's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that Julian had it right when she said, all will be well. Yes, I see Barbara exclaiming there. Oh, yes, there we go. That yes, all will be well, but that doesn't mean that everything's a-okay right now. It means that in some fundamental sense, God is still God. God is still, as we talked about yesterday, pouring out God's very life for our continued life and our healing and our unifying, our reconciliation. But that doesn't mean that everything is a-okay right now. But we are empowered then, we are emboldened then to act as if the kingdom of God were already coming among us, because we see that it is. And as I say, I think this is easier. Sometimes we do have to act as if. I'm not downplaying that at all. There are days when we have to say, all right, I don't feel it today, but I know it, and so I'm going to act as if it's true. But I think to the extent that we are grounded in an experience through prayer, through worship in regular community, through retreats, through deep spiritual friendships with other people, with our spouses and our children and our friends and our spiritual directors, to the extent that we know in our own lives that betrayal can be a handing over to life as well as to death, that will make hope easier for us. I also take great comfort from Rebecca Solnit, who is a writer and an activist, and she wrote a book back, I think it was originally published in 2003, called Hope in the Dark. And it was set in the context of our invasion of Iraq and the kind of crumbling of a progressive response to that moment. And then she published it again in 2015 as we were heading, as we had just passed, as we were heading into the current political reality that we're in. And she reminds us that hope always emerges from the darkness rather than from the light. Because hope is about what will happen in the future. And we can never know what will happen in the future. The future is always dark to us. And so we shouldn't let the darkness of the present moment dissuade us from our hope, because hope is always a product of the darkness. And she says that hope, and it's really an amazing book, because she really sort of traces hope in all these different contexts. But she talks at one point, I think it was about Thoreau, on civil disobedience. And she says, Thoreau wrote this book, this text on civil disobedience, talking about nonviolent resistance. And nobody for 100 years even read what he wrote, much less acted on it, until a man named Mahatma Gandhi came along. And we all know what happened there. He read on civil disobedience. He took in the principles of nonviolence, grounded them in his own spiritual and cultural context, and then responded in a nonviolent way that not only changed his own country, but changed the whole world. He in turn influenced Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement here in America, which then in turn influenced Nelson Mandela in South Africa and the freedom fighters there. So this, guy who lived in, the middle of nowhere at that point in Massachusetts, wrote this text that nobody read or commented on in his own lifetime. And he could never know that 100, 200 years from when he first wrote that, people he would never know anything about, in contexts he couldn't possibly imagine, were able to work for freedom. She uses that and many other examples to point out that we never know when we plant seeds. We have no idea how or when they will flourish. And so we should not be dissuaded from planting those seeds just because they seem, totally no optimism that they will bear fruit. We can't see how our small action could possibly have any effect. I promised you 45 minutes. I have a little more, so I'm going to keep going. But just a little more here. This is again from Rebecca Solnit on hope. She says, hope is not like a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. I say this because I have noticed wars will break out, the planet will heat up, species will die out, but how many, how hot, and what survives depends on whether we act. The future is dark, with a darkness as much of the womb as the grave. The future is dark, with a darkness as much of the womb as of the grave. That paradox of the womb and the grave, the tomb in which Jesus is laid that becomes the womb from which he is reborn, that's really at the center of the Christian faith, that mystery, that paradox, that metaphor to describe God's action in our lives and in the world around us, that from death comes life. I mean, that is, if you had to boil down the Christian message, the good news, into one phrase, that is it right there. That the womb is the grave and the grave is the womb. I want to end with two more quotations here to set us up for two practices that can help us to cultivate hope. And they may seem paradoxical, they may seem like opposites, these two practices, but I think they're actually two different sides of the same practice and will lead one into the other. The first is the practice of grief. I think this is a time, any time, but particularly this time that we're living in right this moment, is a time to practice grief. It's a time to look around, to really take in the death that surrounds us, the darkness that threatens us, to allow our hearts to be broken at the brokenness we see in our own lives and in the world around us. Because grief, when we allow ourselves to grieve, we both say no to denial, that we're not going to deny reality, and we allow our grief, our tears, to move us into a different place. They become holy tears, and they become the tears of God. We essentially allow God's mercy to flow through our grief. Cynthia Bourgeault has this to say in The Wisdom Jesus, this is from The Wisdom Jesus, about tears. She says, "I have often suspected that the most profound product of this world is tears. I don't mean to be morbid. Rather, I mean that tears express that vulnerability in which we can endure having our heart broken and go right on loving. In the tears flows a sweetness not of our own making, which has been known in our tradition as the divine mercy. Our jagged and hard-edged earth plane is the realm in which mercy is most deeply, excruciatingly, and beautifully released. That's our business down here. That's what we are here for. That our grief can actually be a vulnerability in which we can endure having our heart broken and go right on loving. And I would say that's a great way to describe what we were talking about yesterday as that outpouring of God's life into the world, allowing our hearts to be broken and to go right on loving. So grief is one practice. The other, and this again I said may seem paradoxical, but I don't think it is the practice of joy. And this is where we will end up tomorrow, more on joy and reverence. But joy, in the midst of death, we are also in life. In the midst of a pandemic, it is breathtakingly beautiful outside. The flowers are blooming. The birds are coming out. The bees are emerging from their winter hibernation. Life is continuing. We're finding new ways to connect with one another. We're finding ways to slow down. We're finding that the earth is healing itself without all the plane travel, that you can actually see from space that the air quality is better, that pollution is down. These are all things to be joyful about. And again, Rebecca Solnit has this to say about joy. She says, joy doesn't betray, but sustains activism. And when you face a politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated, and isolated, joy is a fine initial act of insurrection. I'm going to read that whole thing again because it's short and it's worth repeating. Joy doesn't betray, but sustains activism. And when you face a politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated, and isolated, joy is a fine initial act of insurrection. Again, like hope, joy does not come from optimism. It is different from happiness. It's not about, it's not that bubbly feeling inside, though it may contain some of that. But joy, like hope, is founded on the conviction that God is still faithful, whatever the outward sign, whatever we see around us. And we have so much in our world, whether it's politics or in other areas, that does aspire to make us fearful, alienated, and isolated. And so joy is a wonderful way to resist that temptation, to resist those voices, to look outside and allow ourselves to be stunned by the beauty that surrounds us. And I think it's even in the most depressed places in the world, many of them here in our own country, I still think there are areas of beauty that anybody could grab hold of. Even though it's easier perhaps when you're on 26 acres on the Hudson than it would be in an impoverished inner city somewhere, there's always something beautiful around us. And so it's a wonderful practice to grab hold of that beauty and to allow it to knock us over. So with that, I will stop. I'm going to stop the recording button, and then we can open it up for questions or comments.